I'm a taxpayer group. I do conservative politics, been active with the Republican Party for a long time. And I get, you'd wonder why press guys would come up and say, oh, and assume that you were anti-immigrant or hostile immigration. I'm thinking, where does this come from? I'm with Ronald Reagan's party, George Bush's party, both Bush's parties. The party that nominated McCain in the middle of what was supposed to be this anti-immigrant panic, the most clearly pro-immigration reform candidate that you could have run. I mean, we had a guy who ran as a Republican as Mr. Anti-Immigrant. His name was Pat Buchanan. He got like 1% of the vote, okay? So where do we get this idea that everybody takes this position? And you realize that there are a handful of very loud voices. It's like going out to a pond and hearing an awful lot of bullfrogs, or it seemed like a lot of bullfrogs. When you drown the pond, it's 3 very hard-working bullfrogs. And we've had some very loud voices, some very unnecessarily angry voices that have been too loud. And the reason they've been allowed to be heard is that the other people here, have been silent. I don't mean individuals here, but the business community. 2000, I was at a meeting, Republican National Committee, 10 guys in the room with the head of the party, and the head of the chamber, and NFIB, and NAM, truckers, all the various big groups. I was there for taxpayers, and the question was, what's important? And they went around the room, and half of them said you should take all the trial lawyers and put them in a plastic bag and drop them in the river, and the other guy said you should cut the capital gains tax. But they basically were the 2 thoughts that they had, which were both fine thoughts. But the RNC chairman, thank you very much, and started to leave. And like the second to the last scene in the Columbo TV show, the guy from the chamber said, well, there's this other thing. I have a question. Well, what is it? Well, I don't know how to bring it up. Well, what is it? Well, we've never worked on it. What is it? We're running out of workers. And we have to do something about immigration, but we, chamber, we, business groups, have never worked on the immigration issue before. They sort of had some idea that it was somebody else's job, that they weren't allowed in, that it was, some silo over there that other people fought over. And they hadn't gotten involved. And frankly, went another decade without engaging in a helpful way. And so by being off to the side and letting ugly voices, control it, you ended up with a completely bizarre view of where the modern conservative movement are. And then the various communities of faith didn't make as much noise or weren't as focused on this issue as perhaps they are becoming now. So that's how we got this idea that a party that nominates Reagan and McCain was somehow hostile to immigration, that the movement was somehow in favor of, had some bizarre notion that there was a limited amount of assets in the country or a limited number of jobs in the country. That's Malthus. That's labor union talk. That's not the Ronald Reagan understanding of economic growth. So how did that happen? Then we had guys who claimed to be conservatives who said, well, here's what we should do. We should just enforce the law first. Okay, that's the conservative position. That's the pro-law position, is enforce the law. Now, I'm old enough to remember the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. And I don't remember any conservatives coming up to me and saying, you know what, Grover, I think first thing we should do is enforce the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. And once we've enforced it, and because it's a crime to drive more than 55 miles, and lock them up or find all these people because there's all this illegal driving going on in the country, then we could have a conversation down the road about whether highways built for 75 miles an hour and the laws at 55 miles, whether that makes sense. And we've had an immigration set of laws that were designed for 55 miles an hour, for an economy, for a country that doesn't make any sense at all. And the answer from a standpoint of people who care about liberty is, if you've got a stupid law, you change it. You don't enforce it first. You change it and make it a reasonable law, and then you can enforce a reasonable law. The other one we'd get from some people who said, no, don't worry your pretty little head about immigration. These people who are out trashing the party's brand on the subject. You should go out and talk to Hispanic Americans and say, we'd like your vote on other issues. So you should say, well, I'm here to talk to you because we agree on life and marriage and taxes and stuff. So you don't mind if Igor here goes upstairs grabs your aunt, drags her down the stairs, and throws her out of the country. That won't interfere with our conversation about all the things we have in common. Well, oddly enough, it does. You never get to the second part of the conversation until you've gotten across that you're not threatening to deport their friends, their family, their relatives, their coworkers. Then you had the people who said, well, since we, these voices, talk radio show characters, a couple of nasty organizations, since we've so poisoned the well, you should join us in not letting Hispanics come in the country because they won't vote for you because we've been trashing them. Which is, you know, the old argument about the guy who doesn't his parents and wants to be treated nicely because he's an orphan. I'm sorry. That's chutzpah. You know, really, to cause that problem for the conservative movement, the Republicans, and then announce that we ought to behave as if we were you, strikes me as odd. The other one that you'd sometimes get from people who want you to look at this politically rather than in terms of what's right. They'd say, well, this is only irritating Hispanics. And they're just, first of all, just wrong. I'm reminded when there was a fight a couple years ago, some people said that we should set aside the First Amendment and we should outlaw or ban a mosque from being built in New York. And that this would only bother the 1% of Americans who are Muslims. Well, a week after this blew up, the Jewish Forward, the New York Jewish publication, started writing the big article about how when the Dutch owned Manhattan, they didn't allow Jews in. And then when the British took over Manhattan, they would allow Jews in, but no synagogues, no buildings. And so they immediately went to, I know they're shooting at those guys, but they mean me. 2 weeks later, because Pony Express takes a while, Salt Lake City newspapers started writing about the fact that in 1900, the mayor of New York had banned Mormon missionaries. So everybody immediately took so people thought they were throwing stones at a handful of people over here, and all of a sudden you had a whole series of communities going, that's me that you're talking about. We also have the false signifier issue, and that is people look up low information voters, which is most of us because we're busy. They look up and they say, oh, that's the pro-life candidate, I'm for him because he won't raise my taxes. Because they know that candidates come in packages. And so you don't have to ask somebody 20 questions. If you ask where they are on one issue, you sort of know everything else, and you often do. Well, somehow, because of the radio talk show host, and people would watch the guy on TV who was anti-immigrant get described as very conservative, people began to think that the anti-immigrant position was one of those signifier issues. And that's why I think all 10 of our presidential candidates, even though in their heart many of them weren't there, started sounding pretty goofy on immigration in the last election. And what's changed just in the last few months is that we now have, those were false signifiers, the idea that just because somebody says something snotty about immigration, they must be against cutting the capital, they must be for cutting taxes. They do not come in a package that way. And now we have Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio, a number of religious leaders out front saying, no, that's not us. That's not the conservative position. Republican leaders going, that's not the Republican position. And I think we've neutralized the argument that everybody thinks, which is step one. But we're going to have to do better than that. And we're going to have the modern center-right movement not only make clear that there are some voices, but we're going to have to unite the center-right. Because at the end of the day, the people who have stopped reform of immigration, going back to the 60s, are the labor unions, which killed the Bracero program and other opportunities to have more people come in legally and stay legally, the zero population growth people, the guys who just don't like people at all, the population control folks. These are the guys who all live on the left, who set up some organizations, front groups pretending to be on the right. But we're going to need to have a united center-right to come up with reasonable pro-immigration policy, because the heart and soul of the modern left is hostile to that. Now, they've been coasting on the fact that nothing's been going, and they say, well, Pat Buchanan's the reason it didn't pass. Really? First, 2009, 2010, Democratic House, Democratic Senate, Democratic President. Pat Buchanan was what kept them from doing something? No, it wasn't. It was the AFL-CIO and the structures embedded in the left. So, one, we are getting past this false sense that conservatives are supposed to be anti-immigrant. or that they are. They clearly don't vote that way when they're choosing presidents and those issues. And congressmen and senators, some of whom have said odd things because they thought that's what they're supposed to say. We need to be very gentle about letting them walk back and away from that. And I think we can do that. I think we can accomplish it. And Texas is really front and center on this. And the reason for that is that just as there are these signifiers, when Marco Rubio says, this is the conservative position, it's pro-immigrant, a whole bunch of guys go, oh, okay, makes sense to me. I know he's good on all these various issues, and that's helpful. When Texas speaks, it's like Marco Rubio. I'm from Massachusetts, okay, at least before I emigrated to the United States. And I can tell you that for conservatives in Massachusetts, if somebody said, you know, there's a really interesting idea that this guy in Vermont had, you'd go, okay. But if they say, guys in Texas think this is a good idea, all of a sudden you'd listen. You go, okay, what is it? So Texas's voice on making sure that the center-right movement, conservatives, Republicans, Americans, are seen properly on this issue is an extremely important voice. Thank you.